Good morning. My name is Elaine Wilson, and I have brought a real shocker with me today. It's a man whose name is Merisi. His last name is Merisi. His first name was Michelangelo, but he went by Caravaggio. It just seems that so many of these artists all have nicknames anymore. Well, this will be an interesting man for you to take a look at. If you're already familiar with him, then you're going to see some of his famous works. If you are not familiar with him, you're going to learn about those works. He really lived a very short, only 39 years, a short but very fascinating life. The word gentleman would never, ever apply to him, but he could be gentle and he could be extremely outrageous. So I think it's going to be a very interesting hour for all of us. So let's take a look at who he was and what he did. I called him wildly talented because he is. He still influences artists today. He was wildly uncontrollable, and he certainly did influence the lives of some of the people that lived around him during his lifetime. His name is Michelangelo Merisi, which is Italian for of Caravaggio. I will show you these pictures again as we talk, and I will also at the end I will be referring back to this one. I have done 2 books on this man because he's just so incredibly amazing, and I will mention the books to you in case there's one of them, either one. I'll mention the other one when I get to that painting, that you might be interested in learning a lot more about. There he is. 1571 to 1610, so he's late 16th into the early 17th century. He was born in Milan. His father was an architect. He was well respected, and his mother came from what they called a propertied family, which meant that they owned land in Caravaggio and that they had some prestige. Now, Caravaggio and his family will have to leave Milan when he is 5 years old because of the plague. When I have lectured on Titian, I mentioned then that in 1576 he died. Titian died of the plague. Caravaggio's family decides that they will leave and move back to their hamlet, which is outside of Milan, so that they are safe from the plague. Look what year the father died. 1 year later, when Caravaggio was 6 years old. And the tragedy of this is not only his father's death occurred on one night, but so did his death of his grandfather, and within 2 days, his uncle. His mother will die in 1584, and he is about 15 years of age by that time. By that time, because it's a good family in Caravaggio, he has had good schooling and knows good manners. And I mention all of this because it's very important for you to understand or recall that he has a background in how to be a very civilized person. He will decide that art should be his career, and so this same year that his mother died, he was apprenticed to a man in Milan. Milan had artists that had traveled to Venice and had studied. This one had studied with Titian. So he has 4 years of good, solid training. Here are 2 pictures of him. This is him in later years, and I'll show you the entire painting that this one is from then. But this is a pretty good likeness of what he probably looked like as a young man. He will leave Milan, and by 1592 he's living in Rome. But he leaves Milan very suddenly because he'd gotten into a fight with somebody, and a police officer came, and Caravaggio impaled the police officer's hand with a knife. So if this gives you some idea of what kind of a person we're dealing with. Very talented, very capable, but very electric when it came to his emotions. He will go to Rome with nothing, And he finds work almost immediately, working in a shop where he can paint fruit. And he is in Rome for 8 years, and he makes quite a name for himself as an artist. And he ends up, and I'll discuss this later, with his uncontrollable temper, he ends up committing a crime that forces him to then go on the run for the rest of the years of his life. Here is Milan and here is Rome. And here is some of the work that he did. There is a basket of fruit. There is a figure over here behind the basket of fruit. The man that he worked for had many commissions that included figures, and he realized that Caravaggio was extremely talented. So rather than allow him the opportunity to show the world, and certainly the people of Milan, what his talents represented, the man kept him in the shop just painting fruit. Now, what Caravaggio always did was to paint the truth, and so he will do that. He will paint this basket of fruit that I have intentionally allowed you to just take a look at, but now take a closer look at it. The apple is rotting and it has a wormhole in it. He painted what he saw. The leaves have been eaten by some kind of an insect, so there are spaces in them where light is coming through. He will always paint the truth. He will paint what he sees. He will paint what he believes. Over here, there's another apple. And yes, folks, it has a rotten spot in it as well. When he reaches Rome, he's 21 years old. When he's 22, he becomes quite ill with something, and he's hospitalized for 6 months. Now, that's a considerable length of time. He either had malaria or he had been kicked by a horse, and one report said that he hit a door jamb. Something suspicious did happen to him, because the man he was working for in Rome, and the man's family, for the 6 months that Caravaggio is in the hospital, never once came to visit him. So there may have been, the man he was working for was rather a low life to begin with, but he had a very productive studio, and it certainly was a way for Caravaggio to at least get started and make some money. That's a self-portrait, and he did this at the time that he was sick. You notice that his skin is kind of a gray, yellow color, which is the indication that it could have been malaria. Why we have no idea about some of the specifics of this man's life is because he never had a home. He lived on estates. He lived with very, very important people when he was working on paintings for them. And they had large palatial dwellings. And he never kept any notes, and he never did any preliminary sketches that we have been able to find. So all we have of him are his work and references from arrests that were made on him. There are some rotten grapes that he's holding, which of course by now doesn't surprise you at all. And his eyes look a little lifeless. You notice he hasn't put color or light into them, and they have kind of a jaundiced look to them. But he's wearing this curious crown. Now, the ivy leaves, when they were included in art during his time period, were symbols that were used to show that they were preventing any intoxication. Now, I don't see anything down here for him to be drinking, but nevertheless, he wanted to make sure everybody remembered or knew that he was sober during that time. This is the first time in 1595 that he tries to do a painting with more than one person in it. And keep in mind that he had his best training in Milan with that man for 4 years, from the ages of 13 to about 17. But after that, He simply had to pretty much learn on his own. And I'll walk you through this painting because it is important as the first one that he tries with more than one figure in it. There's a musician with a score he's looking at it, and he has his back to you. Then there's a man beside him who's tuning his lute. There's tuning it here. There's his hand down here to strum it. Behind him, this is probably Caravaggio. These two men would have been friends of his. He never made up figures. He painted people who modeled for him, sat in front of him, and posed for him. And the fourth man, who has a quiver on his back, which you can't see very well, it's back in here, but down here he's arranging some grapes. And it's a Cupid, and the Cupid is supposedly, if you could see this larger or clearer, is crying, and so therefore historians think that the song probably had something to do with love that had gone awry, and they are all getting ready to play their instruments or to sing. Now, none of the figures look like they are connected. They are in the same composition, but you could almost take an X-Acto knife and cut each one out separately, and each one of them would stand on their own. But he is learning, and he will learn very well. And you are always included in his work. I'll mention this to you again later on, but there, folks, is your violin. It's laying there. This is going to be the singer. This is your violin and your bow, and it's waiting for you to pick it up and join in the song. He did this one of Bacchus. Bacchus is holding out a glass of wine for you. Bacchus is the god of wine and theater. And as I have already mentioned, Caravaggio could be a very happy and very sensitive person. He had wonderful admirers. He knew how to sit at the finest tables and dine with the very best of manners, but you didn't want to cross him because he could be very ill-behaved. I will mention some more about that. But first about this painting. There is the proverbial rotten apple. The model is a friend of his named Mario Manetti, and Mario Manetti will be his friend until the end of Caravaggio's life. Manetti will not always live in Rome. He will eventually move south of Rome. He marries, he has a family, but he is always very loyal and really does understand Caravaggio. There is a carafe that has wine in it, in case you want more. But this painting, which is in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, is fairly large, and from time to time they go around and inspect all of the paintings and study them closely under microscopes. And when they did, they found that on this one, they hadn't noticed it before, there is a small image that Caravaggio painted on this that shows him at his easel working on that painting. It was quite a day when they found that. He did no preliminary sketching, and as I said, we've found no sketchbooks of his, no notebooks of his. He simply chose the size of canvas that he wanted. He went directly to it, and he started to paint, and he could paint rather quickly. And you'll find as I go through this program that painting quickly will become important because he does move several different times rather quickly. Here are two that he did. He's the same as the other artists that I've shared with you. Many of them repeat the same theme. They think about it and then they say, gee, I could try this a little differently. I could add yellow background behind it. I could change a little bit here and there. And so this fortune teller, this is his friend Mario. This is not. This is somebody else. But notice what's going on there. The fortune teller is making sure that she keeps eye-to-eye contact with the young man whose palm she is reading, because while she gently strokes his right hand, she is removing the gold ring that is on his finger. And he is so enthralled with her and what she's telling him that he doesn't notice until it's too late. He did this one called The Card Sharks. Other artists from other times, later times, Vermeer, Rembrandt, other artists will come, as you're well aware, and study the work, the great works that were done in Italy in the 14th and 15th and 16th centuries. And Rembrandt will paint many normal genre paintings, people who are not famous, people who are not knights or kings or of the church. And then this piece, you'll see what's going on. These two men are playing cards. The one is unaware that the man standing behind him and the man seated across from him are playing one game and he's playing his own. And you notice the man's two fingers are up because the card that he's pulling from his hand will be what he needs to beat that man's hand when he lays down his next card. Caravaggio had girlfriends and he had lots of women admirers. He was a very handsome man. He was a nicely built man and thick dark hair and flashing eyes. And Felice Melandroni will be a prostitute that will pose for him a number of times. She will only live to be 37 years old and her life will be wrought with a lot of wildness, but she is a prostitute that is sought by the more wealthy in the city of Rome, the bankers and even those in the churches, and certainly those that were in important places in the government. This painting is this image is all we have of this painting. This painting was in a museum in Berlin in 1945 when Berlin was bombed, and the building this painting was in was destroyed in the fire that ensued. But from 1600 on, Caravaggio will not paint as many portraits. He will paint mostly religious subjects because that's his source of income. And so many of his paintings are not freestanding as this one was. Many of them are sites that they are at sites that are in churches and they were designed to hang there, and they have been hanging there since he put down his brush. On the side, he would make money painting portraits like this, and I show you this so you can see just what kind of quality of work this man was capable of doing. This one is called The Conversion of Mary Magdalene. The Catholic Church for a long time, until in the mid-20th century, marketed Mary Magdalene as the sister of Martha, and Mary and Martha were the sisters of Lazarus. Well, the Catholic Church finally decided that that was really not the truth. That's a whole other story. However, in this painting you can see Mary looking at her sister Martha. And who do we have? Okay, Felice. He's chosen her to be Mary, who becomes Mary Magdalene, and Martha, who was her friend and also a Roman courtesan, whose name is Anna. And Anna is counting off on her fingers just all the reasons why Mary should turn away from her life of prostitution. I'm not sure what Martha thought she was going to do. Anyway, this is a good bridge to show you a piece that is somewhat secular and yet somewhat religious at the same time. And his works are always filled with more than just images. There are all kinds of symbols and significant areas to look at. Look at the mirror. The mirror represents vanity. But this mirror is reflecting the light from the window or the light from the all-seeing eye of God. And Mary is not only pointing to that, but on her finger she is wearing a ring, which would mean that she has chosen to become a bride of Christ. Also, to get away from her wild and sinful life, she is giving up her powder puff and her alabaster jar, and her comb will no longer be significant. And you'll also notice that she is holding an orange blossom, and an orange blossom represented purity. And of course, her life will be turned around completely when she makes the decision to convert, and the blossom will be quite significant. The piece is very calm, it's very peaceful, but it is really loaded, as you can see, with many interesting facets. Caravaggio will do a series of the disciples, and in this case it is the disciple called Saint Matthew. Matthew was the last of the 12 disciples that Christ chose, and Matthew was the only one who was employed by the Roman government. He was a tax collector, bitterly hated by everybody in his town because he would tax them what he was assessed by the Roman government, and then in order for him and his family to survive, he added on to that price his own fees, and those fees are what caused the people to be so disgusted with him. Now in this piece it's rather dark, but I was able to do this. I took the head of Christ and I was able to at least show you that a little bit more clearly. And you can see it nicely here. And you also, over here, it's very difficult to see the halo, but this is the only figure in this painting that is wearing a halo. And he is standing beside Peter. And he is pointing, though, towards the group of men at the table. Two of the men aren't paying any attention at all. They're counting money. Two of them, including his friend Mario, who posed for this, are looking over at the strangers that have come in. And this man is Matthew. And he's pointing to himself like, oh, me? And of course, when Christ calls him, Matthew gets up and walks away from his position and the life that he had known and becomes a strong follower of Christ, and of course is responsible for the Gospel of Matthew in the New Testament. Other things are going on in this piece, which I'm sure you've come to expect with Caravaggio. Peter and Jesus are both shoeless. They're in their bare feet. The others are completely dressed. These two are dressed in the clothing that would have been worn during the biblical times, and this is the clothing worn by people who lived during the time of Caravaggio. The two money changers ignore the event, but two others are very aware, and pay close attention to the one with his back to you because he has a weapon. And he has started to reach back for the weapon. And look what Peter is doing. Peter is pointing at him and looking at him and is perhaps signaling to him that anything leading toward violence would not be a good idea, that this man has come only to call this man to become a disciple, and that when that happens, they will leave. And this man has no need then for his sword. Christ came across two men walking along the road to Emmaus. One, he had come back from after the resurrection, and they invite him to come in and have dinner at this place. And so he accepts their invitation, and they still just think he's a very nice man. Now, also keep in mind as I show you these, Caravaggio has picked people from the street, not famous people, but people from the street to model for him. So now he has these two men who have suddenly become aware that it is the figure of Christ, it is Christ that is there having supper with them. And you'll notice that they all have the bread with them, and the wine is over here. And as Christ has broken the bread, the two men all of a sudden realize who he is. This man who owns the establishment is clueless. He can't relate to any of that. He's just watching the man sitting at the head of the table. This man's wearing a scallop shell. Scallop shells were worn by pilgrims, and that's an indication that walking along the road to Emmaus, this man was a pilgrim and he was on a pilgrimage. They carried, the pilgrims carried these small scallop shells with them, and they were privileged to be able to knock on the door of people's homes and ask to have that small shell filled with food. That would sustain them until they became hungry, and then they would stop again and get more food. But this is how the pilgrims were able to manage to get food as they moved across the country on their pilgrimage searches. And you'll notice the apple. Why would I disappoint you, and why would he? Of course the fruit has rotten spots in it. And also notice, because he's picked people from the street and he paints the truth, the man that he picked had a torn sleeve, and so he paints the sleeve torn. Caravaggio was a very truthful man with his brush. He did two of these. This is the conversion of Paul. Saul was before he became Paul, he changed his name. Saul was a Roman, and he was bent on destroying every Christian he could get his hands on, and I mean killing them. And he was on the road to Damascus when he is knocked to the ground, and knocked to the ground by the power of God, and loses his eyesight. And you see the figures here. This man's eyes are closed. This man has covered his eyes. Now, notice something else. There are horses here. In the text, if you read the scripture, there is no reference to Saul falling off of his horse. Caravaggio added the horse because he thought it just needed some kind of a different statement. This horse is interesting. It curls in around and its head comes back up to look at the two men that are up here. This man, or this horse, is lifting its foot as though it could stomp on Saul, and he wouldn't be aware of it because he's lost his eyesight. First of all, the one over on the left side. There is an angel who is shepherding Jesus as Jesus reaches down with both hands open to call to Saul, to ask him why he has betrayed him, why he cannot accept him. And of course, it is this very, very dramatic moment in this man's life that turns his entire life around. Other figures that are in this piece, there was the man that would have been with Saul as his assistant, and he has armed himself with a spear, and he has a shield, and he can see these two, and he is determined to protect this man who has suddenly fallen to the ground. And there is Saul. And when he did this piece, Caravaggio also shows that he had been wearing the helmet of the Roman, the same helmet that this man is wearing. It's down here on the side. Now moving to this piece. Over here, the horse and the groom have no idea what's going on. They can't see the light. They are simply waiting. They can certainly see that Saul has fallen on the ground. And Saul not only has his eyes closed, but his arms are extended as though he is giving up or he is going to receive whatever is coming towards him. And you also notice something else. Caravaggio painted Saul with his head out here and his body back here because the Bible says that this particular event will turn his life upside down. He will become a very, very, very important pillar along with Peter in support of the Christian faith. And he will write many of the books that are in the New Testament. But at this point, he's still being what we would call converted. One thing that has happened, you see that in neither one of these is he holding a weapon of war or anything that would harm anybody. The sword that he had is laying over there to his side. When I look at this piece, I'm always reminded of the story when Caravaggio was doing this. He was painting this in a church in Rome. And a small priest came along and was looking at the painting, which is rather impressive in size. And he said to Caravaggio, why is the back of the horse facing out like that? And Caravaggio did not like to be interrupted when he was working, and he just turned to him and he said, because, and he went back to work. Well, the little man wasn't quite satisfied with that answer, so he said, well, I thought that this was about the light of God coming to immerse the figure of Saul. What's the horse doing in it? And Caravaggio turned to him and through clenched teeth, he said, the horse is standing in God's light. And the little man thought better of asking any more questions. He just scurried away. But the church fathers also tell that one time one of the very timid nuns came by for the first time to look at this piece and was shocked and backed up because she thought the horse, it was so lifelike that it might back out of the painting and kick her. So people have had some fun with this story. This is a piece that is in that same church where the one I was just speaking about is located. Rome has a church with a Popolo chapel. And these two pieces are on either side of the altar. Imagine walking in and standing mid-aisle and looking from one to the other. These huge, absolutely fascinating pieces of work done by a man who worked directly on the canvas, no sketching, and pretty much had learned how to paint all by himself. Now let's take a look at this one. Peter, as I'm sure some of you are well aware, was not a Roman citizen, so they could crucify him. And when they took him to the hill where he was to be crucified, Peter said, no, not right side up. My Lord was crucified right side up. I am not that good. You must crucify me upside down. And you can see Peter laying, there's a crossbeam back through there, and there's the upright coming this other way. And you can see the nails in Peter's feet and in his hand, and then the three men struggling to get the cross up. This man has a shovel. They are going to stand this upright and put it into the ground so that Peter will be crucified upside down. Some books will tell you that this is a picture that, or an image that Caravaggio did of himself. I'm not sure about that, but I just thought I would mention that to you because, again, to remind you, these are all real people. Now, he didn't have somebody lay on the cross and be crucified, but he did have a person come in and pose in that position, and then all Caravaggio had to do was to add the nails. When the disciples, after the resurrection, are meeting, Christ appears to them. Well, Thomas wasn't there. And so later on they say to Thomas, oh, you should have been there because Jesus, the Christ was there, came to see us. And Thomas said, yeah, right, okay. When I can put my hand in his side and I can see the nail prints on the backs of his hands, I'm going to believe. Well, lo and behold, next thing that happens is Christ does appear, and here we have Caravaggio's interpretation of Christ taking Thomas's hand And you can see the nail hole in the back, and guiding his fingers to where the opening actually was, where Christ had been speared. This piece is powerful. This piece is large. Oftentimes, Caravaggio's figures are life-size, and they often hit the lower edge of the frame, so that when you stand in front of these, any of his paintings, as I have done, you feel as though you are actually in the painting. You are a part of that scene. He had to set up studios wherever he went, and he always looked for a space that he could use that had a strong light source, a strong door or window opening, some way that he could get a strong light source, and you can see it coming in across this piece right here. He often left his backgrounds intentionally plain. Why? You decide where he is. You are in the painting with them. You are looking at what's going on. So you make those decisions. He has made the decisions that he has made to show you what needs to be shown. And then you add the rest to that yourself. This is one that he did, which is called the Taking of Christ. This is when Christ is in the garden and Judas has gotten the 30 silver coins, and he is going to show the people who want to arrest Christ which one he was. No newspaper, no television, no telephone, no way to know who was who unless you knew the person. And of course Judas does know Christ. So here is Judas, and he has agreed that he will kiss the cheek of the man who is Christ, and then they will know that they are arresting the right man. And there is the Christ figure. And Christ is wearing the traditional colors, the reds and the blues, that were the colors that he was known for wearing, so people who could not read or write would be able to also understand clearly what's going on here. And you'll notice that he has accepted this. Notice the position of his hands. Back here, that is Caravaggio. And Caravaggio has come to look over the shoulders of the people arresting Jesus. Over here, you see John. John has his hands thrown up in the air. He's going to run away. He's going to yell for help because of what is going on right there in front of him. You'll also notice something else. I spoke a little bit ago about the light. The light in this painting is coming from lanterns, and this lantern is lighting this area. You'll notice it's dark over here. You'll notice that there's no background except just the canvas painted behind it, and it's dark down here. Caravaggio is holding the lantern. He had to do two of these. This is St. Matthew again, and St. Matthew again, as I mentioned, writes the first book in the New Testament, the first gospel, and the people want a painting of St. Matthew with the angel. And so he finds this man, and he poses him, and he does this wonderful painting, and he shows it to them, and they go, this is not good. First of all, this is supposed to be Saint Matthew, who we look at with high esteem, and you're showing him with dirty feet. That's not going to work. And then there's something else about this that doesn't suit us. It looks like this little angel is trying to teach Matthew how to write. Matthew's holding the book, and the angel is guiding his hand. And this just is degrading. I mean, we can't take this piece. So he goes, okay, well, I can do another one. So the next one that he does is the one to the right. Now this time the angel is counting off points to remember on their fingers. And so that was acceptable. And you'll also notice that in this one, Matthew is wearing a halo. You'll see that better when I remove the yellow block. But in this one, Matthew has clearly learned how to write and record things, information, and understands, and is writing his own book, only with coaching from the angel, but not direct support like you see over here. He has done what he can to make Matthew appear casual. This man who posed for him is different from that one, of course, but he's leaning on, he's got his knee up on a bench, which is tilted a little bit, but it's a little bit more, was a little bit more to their liking. He did this one in 1604, and this one is called The Entombment of Christ. Nicodemus is in this painting, and he's looking directly at you. You'll notice too, the next figure over is that of John. John is the youngest disciple. John is the only disciple that will follow Christ to the cross and be at the crucifixion. The others have all scattered like chickens. They've gone away to hide. So that what has happening to Christ won't happen to them. But there is John lifting the upper part of Christ's body. Christ's hand is significant because it is brushing along this stone, and this is the cornerstone. This is to represent the cornerstone of the church. Virgin Mary is there. Mary Magdalene is there. She's weeping into a little white hanky that she has in her hand. And behind them is the other Mary. And she is lifting her arms up in the air, heavenward, gesturing signs of grief over the scene that is unfolding in front of her and the death of her Lord. Now, it's a Caravaggio piece, so notice there will be other things included. Notice John's hand is at the point where Christ was speared, and Christ's the nail holes are in his hand down here. And something else is interesting about this piece. There was a plant in those days that they thought warded off evil spirits, and Caravaggio has chosen to tuck that plant right in the very front of the painting. And to give you some idea as to the scale of many of the paintings that you've been looking at with me, take a look at these people, and then the painting. And just imagine if the painting had been brought down to the floor, these figures would be life-size. So it gives you an idea of the empowering effect of this man called Caravaggio. Oh, this piece called The Death of the Virgin. Oh, this turned out to be quite a disaster for the public. There had been a woman that was pregnant, and she was a prostitute, and somehow or other she ended up drowned in the river. And the rumor is that Caravaggio had her body, after it was pulled out of the river, had her body laid out so that he could use her as the Virgin in this painting. He needed a woman to pose for him, and he just thought that would work. Well, you can see that she probably is pregnant, and she does have dirty feet, which he should have known was not going to go over well. However, Mary Magdalene, who is that Anna, who was the friend of Philidi, Anna is posing here as the other figure. This is not Philidi, this is somebody else. But she is posing there. But they said about this, it just looked like the cast-off body of a woman, and it kind of does. But it was what Caravaggio had interpreted the scene might have looked like when the Virgin Mary died. He does put a halo behind her head, and these figures are again life-size. And there is some concern about how the Virgin Mary actually died. John was entrusted with taking care of her, and he dies in Ephesus, and he's about 100 years old, and he has supposedly taken Mary with him. I have visited a place in Ephesus where they say that the foundation for her home actually was. So she could have been there. Some people have said that she was just assumed directly into heaven, that she did not die a physical death as a regular person would. Somebody found a tomb in Israel at one point in Jerusalem, and they thought that that might be her tomb, and they opened it up, and there wasn't even any oil marks in it. So clearly, how she died, where she died, and when she died is probably not as important as the fact that she is alive now in heaven, and that is probably what is most important. But this painting, without any question, was rejected. The patron really didn't think it was fit for his collection. Fortunately, it wasn't destroyed. Caravaggio will not stay in Rome till the end of his life, and the reason for that is that he gets into a fight. He decides that he is going to take on a bet of a man named Tomasini, and Tomasini liked to bet by playing a game, and in this case it was going to be tennis. You also find it interesting that Tomasini was probably the pimp for Philide. So there were some interesting connections between these two men. Well, the tennis match didn't go exactly the way Caravaggio thought it should. He thought that Tomasini had cheated. So he jumped over the fence, and with his ever-ready knife, he stabbed Tomasini in the thigh. He caught him and it scraped across the femoral, or whatever it's called, main artery in his leg, and the man bled to death. Now Caravaggio, he's fought with people. He stabbed the hand of the policeman, and he'd been called for other altercations, but he'd never killed anybody. Now he has this, and he's classed as a murderer, and so therefore he is now on the run, and so he has to get out of Rome. And again, no newspaper, no television, and no video cameras, and off he goes. When he does this, he leaves with a price for his head. In those days, if you were convicted of murder, the way the ransom was paid is the person who found you cut off your head and brought it into court as proof, and then you got your ransom money. So he really has to run to keep from being beheaded. You're going to notice in these last several pictures that I'm going to show you that there really is in the last 4 years of his life, because he leaves in 1606 and he dies in 1610. You're going to find that there's even more drama, in case you haven't already had enough. He will continue to use the strong chiaroscuro, which is the Italian term for strong lights against darks, which I have already pointed out to you without using the name. And you're also going to see that he's, for some reason or other, his commissions that he accepted and the ones that were offered to him, a lot of them dealt with violence or torture or death. So let's take a look at some of those. This one is called The Beheading of Holofernes. Judith was a beautiful Jewish woman, and her city was under siege. And this king, Holofernes, was outside the city gates, and he was going to attack the city and destroy and kill all of the people. And Judith thought she had to do something, so she went to the city fathers and she said, let me see if I can make a difference. So she took her maid, Abra, and they go to the tent, the campsite where Holofernes is. And they ask if they can see the king. Well, nobody would deny the king the opportunity to see such a gorgeous woman, so they let her do that. And she and Opera do that on a regular basis for some time. And they make a habit, they will stay at camp a lot, but they make a habit out every evening. They will take a basket which they consider show them, the guards, it has harmless things in it, and they have it covered with a cloth, and they take that out into the desert so that they can honor their own faith, their Jewish faith, and then they come back. Well, Holy Furnace is going to have this great big drinking party the night before that he attacks Judith's city. So she knows that she doesn't have much time left. So she and Aubrey design this plan. And they get him drunk. And then he stumbles back to his tent, and of course she follows along. And as soon as he passes out on the bed, she takes his knife and cuts off his head. And then they put the head in the basket that they've carried outside of the city, or outside of the tented area, cover it with a cloth, and you could see Ambra right here, holding the cloth, getting ready. They'll put it in the basket. They take it back, and they perch that on the top of the wall around the city. So when the soldiers come the next morning and see that their general has been beheaded and his head is on the wall of the city they were supposed to lay siege to, the battle is over and the men run away. So that's a very encapsulated story of the biblical story about what happens. But notice the quality of the work that Caravaggio was able to do. If you have ever painted portraits, his work is just exceptional. And look at this. And this is more than likely his own image that he has worked with to put in this painting. But you can see there just the detail that's in those pieces. Also notice that there was some time between these two paintings. This was done in Rome. This one was done on the run. And this woman is elderly. But this woman is not only elderly, but she's suffering from serious thyroid problems because their two goiters are right there on the front of her neck. As I've always said to you, have to look into paintings. Caravaggio will go out of favor because of the goriness of some of the paintings, because of some of the honesty, and because people just really wanted to look, faithful people just really wanted to look at nice pictures. His work will go out of favor after he dies, and it will, the paintings that are in the churches stayed, but the ones that were single pieces, a lot of them just kind of went in closets, and this one wasn't discovered until 2014, 6 years ago. And they found it in an attic in Toulouse. They cleaned it, realized what it was, and they can analyze these. They can check the paint, they can check the canvas, they can check all the things. They would know if it was his or not. A private person bought this painting last year, bought that particular painting. When he is on the run, he's in Malta. In 1601, while Caravaggio was still in Rome, this man, Wignacourt, became the head of the Knights of Malta. The Knights of Malta prided themselves on taking care of the women and the poor and the elderly, and so they were a gentle group, except they could be very vicious and very cruel if any of their members were crossed. Caravaggio, because of his name, is highly respected in Malta, and so they induct him into the Knights of Malta. These knights were all supposed to have come from royal lineage. Well, his mother had a small amount of lineage, but not certainly the level to which the other knights. But he was only there for 3 months, because this is what happened to him. He ends up in here. He ends up in here. This is a birdcage. This is a lighted view of the inside of something that looked like a beehive. It had originally been a cistern, and there was only one opening to it, and it was in the street under a grate, a 3-by-3 opening. But the knights chose to use that for the people that they considered to have caused the greatest crimes against them. And this was guarding the harbor into Malta. Caravaggio, for some reason or other, had some bad feelings about one of the knights, and so he went to the knight's door, and the knight wouldn't open the door, so he kicked it in, and he beat him up pretty good. And the knights, of course, recognize him, and he is jailed, and he will be expelled, but he lives in this birdcage, in this hole, for about a month, until somebody, and they think it was him, somebody lowered a rope down one night into that space and lifted the grate off, and Caravaggio jumped up, ran out, got down here to the water's edge, and caught a boat and left. Wisely he left. They will go on to expel him from their group. They call him a foul and rotten limb. And then later, because he has embarrassed one of their own and beat him up, they decide that they will chase him. And as if you murdered somebody, somebody had to find you, cut off your head, and take it back for the ransom. In this case, when they found somebody that had harmed one of their own, they would chase them down, and they would badly damage the face. They weren't cutting at the body, they wanted to damage the face. And they will eventually find him. Here are three that he did of David and Goliath, and again the time frame is 2 to 3 years. This is the story that's in Samuel 1, chapter 17, and it's about a young man with a slingshot who hits the giant Goliath square in the head with a stone and knocks him out and then cuts off his head. Curious things about this piece. In this one that he did, Goliath is laying face down and his head has been taken off and he's tying it. David is tying it with string so he can carry it, and there is the knife laying there beside him. Here is the knife in this piece, and in this one he's just grabbed him by the hair. And over here in this one, you see that he's grabbed him by the hair and his knife is here, the sword. Supposedly these young men are all Caravaggio's interpretations of himself, because these heads are all images of Caravaggio. This one is called Christ at the Column, and he did that one in 1607, and he did this one the year that he died. This is called the Flagellation of Christ. This one made him, when he got to Naples, this made him very successful. They found that piece, a life-size piece, to be just amazing. There's a figure of Christ, and the man is grasped him by the back of the hair. His other arms raised up, and he's going to flog him. But he wants him to hold still, so that's why he's holding on to his hair. Over here, the man again has grabbed him by the back of the hair, and his weapon is down here. And down here is another figure, very dark, but you can see that he is leaned down and he has bound up some wood, and he's going to use that to flail at the body of Christ. And Christ in this piece looks kind of droopy. Well, you would be too if the man standing beside you was kicking you and knocking your leg out from underneath you. And that's what's going on there. So it's a lot of bad treatment going on in these two pieces as Caravaggio imagined it. I haven't said a lot about composition. I do that sometimes and sometimes I don't, but I do want to point it out with this one because it's really simple. This is the noble side, the vertical side. This side is where all the action is, all the drama. And if you notice the vertical lines, the vertical line and now all the diagonal lines that come into this, and that they repeat each other. Caravaggio was a very fine artist, no matter what you say about him as a person. was a very fine artist. He understood composition. He understood the use of light and dark, chiaroscuro. He understood how to paint figures. He was an amazing, amazing artist. Something that we cannot take away from him, and certainly don't do in this day and age. Here are some that he did of St. Jerome. And again, these are commissioned pieces. He painted this one when he was in Rome, and this is before he murdered Tommasoni. And this one he painted in Malta while he was on the run. St. Jerome was a cardinal. St. Jerome was draped in red because that was the color of the cardinals. In each one of these, he's holding a book and he's writing. He's doing translation from Greek into Latin, and we then get the Vulgate that was used for many years by the Catholic Church. There's a skull that's in both of the paintings. There's that one, and the other one is over here. In this one, he's wearing a halo. In this one, his cardinal's cap has been hung behind him. Here is something going on in the background, which doesn't happen often. He is holding, he has the cardinal's cap is hanging behind him. And you'll also notice in this piece, if you know about St. Jerome, he lost his eyesight later in life, and he had to be read what he then needed to translate into the next language. And so the candle is here, but Caravaggio reminds us that he cannot see because the candle is not lit. But there is a crucifix in this piece laying on the table beside the skull. When the Knights of Malta decide to expel him as a foul and rotten limb, they do it in this room. In fact, they do it right there. And what's interesting about it is the largest painting that Caravaggio ever did, and he did it in 1608, 2 years before he died, is this one right back here. I want you to take a close look at this. It's absolutely amazing. It's one that does have some background, but the background is a jail. And in the foreground you can see the executioner with the knife behind his back, reaching down now to pull up the head of John the Baptist, and the jailer here pointing to, telling him to put it in this basin that Salome is holding, and her mother is all of a sudden going, oh my gosh, what have I done? And she's standing there with her hands up to her face. Also notice that in this piece, you have two men who, even though they're in jail, probably feel pretty lucky. They're not out here. John the Baptist was known for wearing fur from the animals, and here is the fur here, and then of course he's been modestly draped. Notice the rope hanging down here to hang people with. It's a cruel scene, but it's a beautiful scene. It's an extremely large painting, and curious that it would be in front of it that Caravaggio would be excommunicated from the Knights of Malta. This is the only piece we've found so far in history that he signed. And he signed it in the blood of John the Baptist. Here's two more, Salome with the head of John the Baptist. It was a popular theme in that time, and so many people requested that he paint it for them. There he is on the tray. And that was a painting he sent to a man who was in charge of the Knights of Malta after he had caused some trouble, because he really wanted to get back in eventually. And this one he sent to a patron in Rome who was working to get his life sentence, his death sentence commuted so that he could return to Rome and paint. And so he's going to send that one to his patron there. He was notorious for brawling. The best records we have about him, it's very hard to lecture on him with authority because the records that you have to work with are people's personal accounts, which can be stilted, and or the records from the courts and the arrests, because they were as long as your arm. He got to the point where he felt he had to sleep with a loaded gun beside him and an unsheathed knife under his pillow. And he was right about that because they were certainly after him. This is one that he did called The Raising of Lazarus. This is a very large piece, but it's the second one of this subject. He started one and finished it for the people, and it showed Christ and him raising the body of Lazarus from the dead. And when the critics came in to look at it, they made some rather disgusting comments about it to him, and it irritated him. And instead of just doing like he did with St. Matthew, saying, okay, well, I'll do another one, he went right up to this painting and he slashed the thing to pieces. We have no record of what that painting looked like. We do have the reports of the two men that had been assigned to work with him as his studio assistants on this piece, and they were standing there certainly aghast. And then after he had chopped the whole thing up, he turned to the people who were supposed to have been receiving it and said, I will do a second painting for you, and I think you're probably going to like it. And they scurried away, and when they came back, this is the one that he had done for them. It is a lovely piece. There is Jesus pointing towards Lazarus. They're Mary and Martha, and Mary is leaning down to try to catch the first breaths that Lazarus, who was a corpse in the, he got the men to go down to the morgue in the hospital and bring up this corpse, and he painted the corpse. So that's what's there. In fact, the men started to complain one day about the smell of the corpse, and Caravaggio unsheathed his knife and waved it around, and the men thought better of complaining and then just quietly just stood there and held the figure and waited till the painting was done so they could escape with their lives. You'll see that Lazarus' hand is leaving the skull and the bones behind and receiving the light of life with his other hand. You'll also notice that Caravaggio has intentionally symbolized the cross and salvation and eternal life by putting the position of Lazarus in the shape of a cross. He really thought he was being chased by the Knights of Malta, and he was. And back in Naples, he was attacked by somebody, which we suppose were the Knights, and he had terrible, terrible facial wounds. He will do several paintings while he's in recovery, and this is one of them called The Denial of Peter. Peter is the one at the Last Supper who says to Jesus, oh, I'd never betray you, I'd never deny you. And Jesus said, before the cock crows 3 times, you will have betrayed me 3 times before the cock crows. Okay, here is what happens. He does this painting while he's healing, and he shows symbolically 3 fingers, all pointing towards Peter, who has denied Christ 3 times before he hears the sound of the rooster. And in this painting too, Caravaggio has painted himself. This is his final painting. This is called The Martyrdom of Saint Ursula. And this is done as a piece that he's going to take back to Rome with him because he decided that he can probably, by the time he gets to Rome, he will have been cleared of the murder charges and he can go on painting. When he does this piece, Saint Ursula was a beautiful young virgin, and she was with others, and they were seen by the king of the Huns, and the Huns picked her out as being somebody that he would like to have as his own. And she said, no, I'm already the bride of Christ. And he said, well, that's the end of it. Nobody will have you. And so here she is looking at the arrow that has been speared into her chest. Here is Caravaggio again. And over here is the man holding the bow, empty now because the arrow has pierced the heart of Ursula. As I mentioned, he booked passage on a ship, and the ship was supposed to go to Rome, and it would stop a couple of places along the way so people could get off and get food or whatever, and they get into a terrible storm, and they have to pull in unexpectedly to a place. So the men get off of the ship, and the authorities have been looking for somebody who had committed a crime, and they come down and they look around and they think it's Caravaggio. So they cart him off to prison. Well, he's had enough fracases that he's not sure they shouldn't have him. So he goes with them, find out that it was a false arrest, and he rushes back down to the dock. And by the time he gets there, the ship, which has his 3 paintings that are going to be gifts of his patron in Rome, are gone. And he is going to have to figure out how to get to Rome quickly so that he's there at the dock to get the paintings when they do arrive. Remember that his paintings fell out of favor and that they will continue to surface. Estimates are that during his lifetime he did anywhere from 40 to 80. We haven't found them all yet. At least that's what most historians say. And for 200 years his paintings sat in closets and attics, and this one was found in the city of Toulouse in France, and it was under some leaking eaves. Fortunately, it was salvageable. But that's where they found it. Caravaggio is known for using street people, painting them as he saw them, wearing what they had on, dirty feet and all. He used a lot of strong lights and darks in his work, the term being chiaroscuro. And he always sought the truth. He understood the Bible. He had been educated as a child. And he understood the truth, and he was trying to show the world the truth as he knew it to be. He was a very strong-willed man, I guess you can't doubt that, and he was extremely passionate, not only about his painting, but about his survival. There was a tomb that was opened up that had a lot of bones in it, and when they opened it up, they were able to take the DNA from the bones and trace a number of the people whose ancestors had lived during the time of Caravaggio. But there were 4 bones that they couldn't figure out who they belonged to, and so they find out maybe they belonged to Caravaggio because he had died in this hospital back here. So they found some family members, ancestors in Caravaggio, and they got DNA samples from them, and sure enough, they were his bones. So now they have this structure built with the bones in them. How did he die? Well, when there wasn't a boat, one reading that I found said that he rode a horse. The others all said that he tried to walk through the marshy swamps and died to get to the next place where the boat would pull in and he could get aboard again with either malaria, or it was hot, it was July, sunstrokes, or he was murdered by the Knights, which it could have happened. He did have syphilis, perhaps that killed him, and he did actively use a lot of lead white paint, and the lead white paint at that time was laced with mercury. So it could very easily have been any one or any combination of those things that took his life at the age of 39. But in 2010, Porto Ercole made a big production out of bringing back the 4 bones of Caravaggio and then putting them here in this site. So he finally has a burial site. Fascinating man, an interesting man, a lively man who, if he could have lived longer, would have probably gifted the world with even more than what he was able to have done in the 39 years that he lived. If you are interested in and have any questions about the lecture today, please be in touch at the Willow Valley website, which is there. Or you can always get in touch with me. My email address is there as well. And I have written 2 books, as I mentioned at the onset, that are about this artist. They are here. This one is about Lazarus. This one is about Saul. These books are not only have information in them about the painting and about the artist, but they also have information in them about other artists who worked during their time frame or who interpreted the same subject differently. So the books are a composite of many things, but they are a way for you to understand this artist better and the times in which he lived. And no, the same information about the artist is not in both books. I don't do that. This book will give you one view of him, and this one will give you another. Together, they make an interesting pair, but separately, they can also stand alone. They are at Amazon.com, and you're certainly welcome to get in touch, click on Amazon.com, and then my name, and then the titles for the books will be there. I don't write books about everything that I do, but some of these artists have fascinated me so much that I do include books in my series about them. Next week I start a series of 5 lessons on Russia. The first 2 are the history of Russia, called The Ethical, the Evil, and the Ugly. And if you have any even passing interest in that country or its history, you want to take a look at the handouts that are going to be available for you to request from Willow Valley. But I will be next week I will be starting with Ivan the Terrible. And I'm not going to hit them all. I'm going to hit what I think are interesting points about each one. This is Peter the Great and Catherine, and there is Alexander, and there is Nicholas II, which of course is the last of the Romanov dynasty and the beginning of the socialist system in Russia in he was in 1922, is approximately when it was. So I'll be starting that next week with you, and I do have handouts that go with that. There are 2, and the 2 handouts are for both weeks. So there will not be a different set for the second week when I discuss everybody in Russia from Lenin clear through to Putin. I have spent probably at least 30 different trips to Russia. And I wasn't just there as a tourist, and I wasn't just there for a day and a half. And I wasn't just there to visit important sites. Yes, I saw them, but I was there to work with the Russian people. I have a great deal of interest in Russia. I am not Russian by birth, I'm Scandinavian. But I find that there are many people in this country and around the world that could better understand what's going on or not if they had a little more information. So the book that I write about this and the lectures that I'm going to give on it are not sympathy organizers. They are simply factual, and they simply give you what I consider to be an educated guess for yourself as to where you think Russia fits into today's world. So I hope I see you next Tuesday, 10:30, right here. Now, are there any questions for me? No questions. I love it. I evidently cover more or confuse you more than anybody that I know, because everybody just seems to go off and I think maybe get another cup of coffee or at this point a sandwich. So take care. Have a good week. God be with you. See you next Tuesday. Bye-bye.